The nose. Ryunosuke Akutagawa. When it came to Zenshi Naigu's nose, there was no one in Ikebyo who had not heard of it. It measured 5 or 6 sun in length, hanging down from above his upper lip to beneath his chin. Its thickness was the same, from base to tip. One might say it resembled a long, thin sausage dangling loosely from the very center of his face. Naigu, now past 50, had suffered inwardly over this nose ever since his days as a novice monk through to the present, when he had risen to the post of attending the inner temple. Outwardly, of course, he always maintained a calm air, as though it troubled him not at all. This was not merely because, as a monk who ought to devote himself to longing for the Pure Land to come, he thought it improper to concern himself with his nose. Rather, it was even more because he loathed having others realize that he worried about it. Above all, he dreaded hearing the word nose arise in everyday conversation. There were 2 reasons why Naigu found his nose such a burden. The first was practical. Its very length made life inconvenient. To begin with, he could not even eat alone. If he tried, the tip of his nose would reach into the rice in the bowl. So, during meals, he would have one of his disciples sit opposite him and hold his nose up with a board about 1 inch wide and 2 shaku long. Yet eating in this fashion was hardly easy, neither for the disciple who held the board, nor for Naigu himself, whose nose was being supported. Once, when a young acolyte served in this role, he happened to sneeze, and his trembling hand let the nose drop straight into the gruel. The tail spread far and wide, even reaching Kyoto at the time. Yet this was by no means the main reason Naigu suffered over his nose. What tormented him far more was the wound it inflicted upon his pride. The townsfolk of Ikebyo used to say that Zenshi Naigu was fortunate not to be a layman given such a nose. They thought no woman would ever agree to marry a man with such a nose. Some even remarked that it was precisely because of his nose that he had taken the tonsure and become a monk. Yet Naigu himself never thought that being a monk had lessened, even in the slightest degree, the troubles his nose caused him. His pride was too delicate to be swayed by such external circumstances as whether or not he had a wife. Thus, whether by active means or passive, he constantly sought to restore the dignity that his nose had undermined. The first idea he entertained was to find some way of making his long nose appear shorter than it really was. Whenever he was alone, he would stand before a mirror and experiment with every conceivable angle of his face, trying earnestly to discover some trick of appearance. At times he grew so restless that merely shifting his face did not suffice. He would prop his cheek on his hand or press a finger beneath his chin, gazing intently into the mirror with stubborn persistence. Yet never once did his nose appear as short as he desired. On the contrary, the more he labored, the longer it seemed to grow. At such moments, Naigu would return the mirror to its box with a heavy sigh and reluctantly seat himself once more before his desk to resume reciting the Canon Sutra. Beyond this, Naigu also made a habit of scrutinizing other people's noses. The temple at Ikebyo was a place where sermons and religious gatherings were often held. Within its precincts stood rows of monks' quarters, and every day the bathhouse steamed with water boiled by the temple's priests. Consequently, a great many monks and laypeople came and went. Naigu would examine their faces with tireless care, hoping to find even a single person who bore a nose like his own, so that he might feel some relief. For this reason, his eyes paid no heed to the indigo robes, the white summer garments, or, still less, the orange caps and dull brown priestly vestments he was so accustomed to seeing. He looked not at people, but only at noses. Yet among them all, though there were hooked noses aplenty, none resembled his own. The more this fact repeated itself, the more disheartened he grew. More than once, while conversing with someone, he unconsciously pinched the drooping tip of his nose and flushed like a child, wholly driven by this discomfort. At one point, Naigu even thought to find in the sacred and secular texts some figure whose nose resembled his own, so that he might take at least a little comfort. Yet in no scripture was it written that Madhyayana or Shariputra had long noses. Nagarjuna and Ashvaghosha, of course, were bodhisattvas, endowed with ordinary noses. Once, when Naigu heard in passing that Liu Xuande of Shuhan had long ears, he thought how much less lonely he would feel if only it had been his nose that was long instead. While Naigu pursued such fruitless and passive measures, he also tried, on the other hand, more direct ways of shortening his nose, needless to say. He had done nearly everything conceivable. He once brewed a decoction of crow gourd and drank it. He even smeared rat's urine upon his nose. Yet nothing availed. His nose still hung, 5 or 6 sun long, drooping loosely above his lip. Then, one autumn, a disciple of his, who had gone up to the capital on an errand, returned with news of a method for shortening long noses, taught to him by a physician of his acquaintance. This physician, it was said, was originally a man from China, who had since become an attendant monk at Chorakuji Temple. Naigu, as always, affected indifference, as though such things as noses concerned him not at all. He deliberately refrained from saying he wished to try the method. Instead, in a casual tone, he remarked how troublesome it was to burden a disciple at every meal with the task of holding up his nose. In truth, he was waiting for the young monk to persuade him to attempt the treatment. The disciple, of course, could not fail to perceive Naigu's stratagem. Yet rather than arousing resentment, this very attitude stirred the disciple's sympathy more deeply. Just as Naigu had anticipated, the disciple pressed him earnestly to try the method, and, just as he had anticipated, Naigu in the end yielded to this fervent persuasion. The method was exceedingly simple. Boil the nose in hot water and then have someone step on it. He Temple bathhouse produced boiling water every day. So the disciple drew some into a wooden bucket so hot that one could not even dip a finger in it. But if Naigu were to put his face directly into the bucket, the rising steam might scald him. To avoid this, they placed a wooden tray over the bucket, boring a hole in the center, through which his nose could be lowered into the water. Curiously enough, even when immersed in such scalding heat, the nose itself felt nothing. After a short while, the disciple said, "It should be well boiled by now, I think." Naigu gave a wry smile. Hearing only this much, no outsider would guess they were speaking of a nose. The nose steamed in the hot water, tingled, and itched as though flea-bitten. When Naigu withdrew it from the hole in the tray, the disciple began at once to step on the still steaming nose, pressing down with all his strength. Naigu lay stretched out, his nose extended across the wooden floorboards, watching as the disciple's feet rose and fell before his eyes. From time to time, the disciple would cast a pitying glance at Naigu's bald head and say, "It does not hurt, does it? The physician instructed me to tread firmly, but it does not hurt, does it?" Naigu tried to shake his head to indicate that it did not, but since his nose was pinned underfoot, he could not move it as he wished. Instead, rolling his eyes upward, he stared at the cracks on the disciple's chapped feet and, in a voice edged with irritation, answered, "It does not hurt." In truth, having the itchy part of his nose pressed down in this way felt less painful than oddly pleasant. After a while, as the disciple continued to tread, tiny grains like millet began to appear upon the nose. It looked as though a small bird, plucked of its feathers, had been roasted whole. Seeing this, the disciple stopped his feet and muttered to himself, "Now, I must pluck these out with tweezers." Naigu puffed his cheeks in displeasure and silently submitted to whatever the disciple chose to do. Of course, he did not fail to recognize the disciple's good intentions. Yet, even so, having his own nose treated like a mere object filled him with distaste. With the expression of a patient submitting unwillingly to the surgery of a doctor he does not trust, Naigu looked on as the disciple extracted fatty plugs from his pores with the tweezers. Each piece came out about 4 bu long, shaped like the quills of bird feathers. When this procedure was at last finished, the disciple gave a sigh of relief and said, "We had best boil it once more." Naigu, still frowning as though dissatisfied, let himself be guided once again. When the nose was withdrawn from the second boiling, it was indeed shorter than ever before. It hardly differed from an ordinary hooked nose. Stroking his shortened nose, Naigu peered shyly, almost bashfully, into the mirror the disciple held up for him. The nose, that nose, which once hung down beneath his chin, was now shrunken, almost unbelievably, lingering feebly above his upper lip like a dying breath. The reddish blotches scattered across it were no doubt the marks left by the trampling. Surely now, no one would laugh at him. In the mirror, the Naigu within blinked with satisfaction at the Naigu without. Yet throughout that first day, Naigu could not shake the uneasy thought that his nose might grow long again. Whenever he had a free moment, whether while chanting sutras or taking his meals, he would stealthily reach out and touch the tip of his nose. But the nose remained properly in place above his lip, showing no sign of drooping down again. The next morning, waking early, the very first thing he did was stroke his nose. It was still short. Naigu then felt a lightness of heart, as though he had accumulated merit through years of transcribing the Lotus Sutra. But within 2 or 3 days, he made a disturbing discovery. A samurai who happened to visit the temple on business stared constantly at his nose, with an expression of even greater amusement than before, scarcely bothering to converse at all. What was more, the very novice who had once sneezed and dropped his nose into the gruel passed him outside the lecture hall. At first he lowered his head, straining to suppress his laughter, but at last, unable to contain himself, he burst out in a sudden fit of mirth. And as for the lower-ranking acolytes, though they kept a solemn face while standing before him, the moment he turned his back, they would snicker. This did not happen once or twice, but repeatedly. At first, Naigu told himself it was simply because his appearance had changed. But that explanation alone seemed insufficient. No doubt the novices laughed because of that change. Yet the manner of their laughter was not the same as in the days when his nose had been long. Somehow, a nose grown short being unfamiliar appeared more comical than one long accustomed to sight. Still, Naigu felt there was something more to it than that. Before, they did not laugh at me so openly. Now and then, breaking off his recitation, Naigu would tilt his bald head and mutter this to himself. And whenever he did so, He would gaze vacantly at the image of Samantabhadra hanging nearby, recalling the days only 4 or 5 ago when his nose had been long. Then he would sink into melancholy, like a man fallen into disgrace, brooding on the glory of his vanished past. Alas, Naigu lacked the wisdom to answer the question that tormented him. Within the human heart dwell two contradictory emotions. Of course, no one fails to feel sympathy for another's misfortune. Yet once that person somehow manages to escape his misfortune, we are left with a curious sense of dissatisfaction. To exaggerate a little, one might even feel the urge to see him cast once more into the same plight. And so, before one realizes it, there arises, though passive, a kind of hostility toward him. Though Naigu could not grasp the reason, the discomfort he felt stemmed from sensing, however vaguely, this selfishness of the onlooker in the attitude of the monks and laymen of Ikebyo. Day by day, his temper grew worse. He scolded harshly at the slightest word. In the end, even the very disciple who had treated his nose whispered behind his back, "The Naigu will incur the sin of greed and miserliness." Most of all, what roused his anger was the mischievous young acolyte. One day, hearing a dog barking furiously, Naigu stepped outside. There he saw the boy brandishing a 2-foot length of wood, chasing a shaggy, gaunt mongrel. And not merely chasing it, but shouting as he ran, "Mind your nose! There! Mind your nose!" Naigu snatched the stick from the boy's hands and struck him soundly across the face. The stick was none other than the very board once used to hold up his nose. In the end, Naigu came to resent the shortening of his nose, ill-fated as it had been. Then one night, after sunset, a sudden wind rose, and the sound of the pagoda's wind bells rang so incessantly that it pierced his pillow. On top of that, the cold had sharpened, and the old Naigu found himself unable to sleep. As he lay awake in bed, he suddenly noticed that his nose was unusually itchy. Touching it with his hand, he found it slightly swollen, as if filled with moisture, and it even seemed to burn with heat. Perhaps in forcing it short, I have brought on an illness. With the same solemn gesture he used when offering incense and flowers before the Buddha, Naigu pressed his nose and muttered thus. The next morning, when he awoke early as usual, he found that the ginkgo and horse chestnut trees within the temple grounds had shed their leaves overnight, carpeting the garden with a brilliance like gold. Frost had settled on the roof of the pagoda, and in the faint morning sun, the 9 rings of its finial glistened dazzlingly. Standing upon the veranda with the shutters raised, Naigu drew a deep breath. At that moment, a sensation he had almost forgotten returned to him. In a rush, he touched his nose. What his hand found was not the short nose of the night before, but the long one of old, dangling 5 or 6 sun from above his lip to beneath his chin. His nose had grown back to its original length in the space of a single night. And with that realization, the same expansive lightness of spirit he had felt when it first grew short came flooding back unbidden. Surely now, no one will laugh at me. So Naigu whispered to himself, while his long nose swayed in the dawn wind of autumn. January, Taisho 5, 1916.